Welcome to the official Lawyer Minds podcast. Lawyer Minds is an ever-growing ecosystem for all the resources modern lawyers need. As the official Lawyer Minds podcast, we'll discuss everything from the latest happenings on the website to industry news. Get ready. Here we go. It's time to dive into the minds of successful lawyers. Here are your hosts, Tad Thomas and Mike Campbell.
Dad, how's it going, man?
It's going. We're not going to talk about our trial we lost, right?
We're not going to talk about the trial we lost.
So
we'll do that on Case Autopsy sometime, maybe.
We're going to pretend like it never happened.
It's fine by me.
All right.
It's fine by me.
So then everything's great. Everything's good. It was raining all day, but now the sun is shining. So I don't remember last week at all.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing is you kind of go in there and you swing away and you see what happens. And, we're all going to take our licks, but that doesn't stop it from hurting any less,
Well, let's talk about somebody that won. A good friend of ours yesterday, Chris Nace and his dad bury a $10 million verdict in West Virginia on a case with a baby born with cerebral palsy. So there's your case autopsy. Talk to somebody that won.
Talk to somebody who won. They've been working. They've been in trial on that one for a while.
3 weeks, I think. Yeah.
God
So
bless.
be a good one to talk about.
Yeah, and we're trying cases, man. Courts are open.
Got another one in 3 weeks.
Yep, as do we.
Yeah.
And then you're off to the races. You've got ones pretty frequently after that.
I just had one come off the calendar, which leaves me with 8 between now and the end of the year. So, and my over-under is 5 of them go.
Okay.
So it's going to be a busy year.
One of the things that excites me about the interview we have today is there is a part of this story that talks about the people who kept losing, but kept fighting. And they overcome these girls, average girls, not lawyer types, overcame obstacle after obstacle, and they didn't let their failures get in the way. It just empowered them to move forward. And the book I'm talking about is Radium Girls, and the author is Kate Moore.
Yeah, I got to watch your interview with Kate. I didn't get to participate. I can't remember what I was doing that day, but what a great interview. And, she's I can't wait to read the book. I haven't gotten to read it yet. She's so impassioned about what she found out about these women and their fight. It was inspiring to hear her talk about it.
Oh, it's wonderful. She slipped on the shoes of the people that she wrote about and walked around and felt what they felt and listened to, and it just like we as trial lawyers should try to do with all of our cases, which is just walk around in the moccasins of the person whose story we're trying to tell. She did that with every single one of her characters, and it just bleeds through. It's a powerful story. Great book, and something every lawyer who's listening to this should read.
Mm-hmm. Well, without further ado, Mike's interview with Kate Moore, author of Radium Girls.
All right, I'm really excited about this podcast today. Joining me is Kate Moore, author of the best-selling book, Radium Girls, now available in bookstores and on Amazon, where I got the book because I primarily read on my pad. And what's amazing is that this book has nearly 6,000 5-star reviews, all warranted. Kate, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, nice for everyone to join us. Thank you so much for listening. I'm the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Radium Girls, The Dark Story of America's Shining Women. It is a book that has changed my life, and it's a book that I hope everyone will read because I think everyone needs to know about these women. And I've certainly been just completely blown away by the reaction to the book, and yet not in a way, because the story is so incredible and these women are so extraordinary, that I'm glad people have taken the book to their hearts. So just to give you a little taster of how much people have enjoyed it, it was Librarian's favorite nonfiction book of 2017.
Awesome.
And the American Library Association named it as a notable nonfiction book of 2018. Emma Watson featured it as part of her book club. And it's had all sorts of, incredible reactions. It won the Goodreads Choice Award for Best History. So I'm just thrilled that the women finally are being recognised, because they've contributed so much to the world, really, whether it's through science or through law, which we'll obviously focus more on in this podcast today. But they truly are incredible women who deserve to be remembered, their strength, their sacrifice, their dignity. And so I'm just being, so thrilled to be able to talk to you about them today.
And it is an honor. It is an honor. There's quite an achievement. The book is, it deserves all of those recognitions. And I told you before we got on that we have a fairly large office, and I struggle to buy books for lawyers. This is my new book. Every time I develop a friendship with a lawyer, I'm buying this book, because I think it's so powerful.
Much. Thank you.
What drew you to these stories? I mean, what drew you to write in this book?
So the way I discovered the story of the Radium Girls, because shockingly, so many people don't know about them, and I certainly was one of them. I found them in incredibly, an amazingly serendipitous way, really. So I was sitting, on my sofa in London. You can hear in my accent, those who are listening on audio, I'm from London. I'm an English writer. And I was looking for a new play to direct, because I love theatre and I do a lot of theatre in my spare time. And so I Googled great plays for women. And one of the plays that came back was These Shining Lives by Melanie Marnich. And it's about the Ottawa, Illinois dial painters, those Radium Girls. And the moment I found that script, I fell in love with these women and their story, and felt this really strong desire to tell it. And in fact, I applied for the rights to put the play on in London. And initially we got a knockback and the agent said no. And I felt so strongly about telling this story on stage that I actually phoned the agent in America and begged to be allowed to stage the play. And once I managed to get a yes that we would be able to put the production on, I started researching, because I knew it was based on a true story, and that Catherine Donahue and Pearl Payne and the other women that me and my actors were bringing to life on stage, I knew that they were real people, and felt this enormous responsibility to do justice to their story and to make sure that my theatre production was as authentic as it could be. So I started reading about them. What I wanted to do in my play was really to bring them to life, to dig into the backstory. And so I was looking for a book that would give me the answers about, what were they like as people? What were their weddings like, for example, things like that. And I realized very quickly there was no book actually that looked at the lives of the Radium Girls and appreciated and celebrated them as individual women. There was a great book that was about their legal legacy, about industrial health reform. But as it sounds, it was quite a dry book. And what I wanted was a story that looked at the humanity of these women. And so ultimately I thought, well, if no one else has written that book, why don't I? Because it was a story I felt needed to be told. And I felt the Radium Girls deserved a book that celebrated them and their triumphs and their tragedies, and that really just appreciated them as people. Because, as I say, most people have never heard of the story of the Radium Girls. But if you have, you probably only know of these people as this sort of anonymous group of Radium Girls. And you don't know that they were called Catherine Donahue and Pearl Payne, Grace Fryer, Catherine Sharp. And it was these women that I wanted to commemorate in my book. And so that's how the book came about. I was doing the play, realized there was no book existed that celebrated them. And so I decided to write it.
And it's funny, as you mentioned their names, it impacts me in a way that it's hard to describe, only because you so beautifully describe their stories in the book, and I became very connected with them. And as trial lawyers, one of the things I think we should all try to do is tell the human story and slip on the shoes, the proverbial shoes of the people we're trying to help. How did you go about doing that? And one of the things I think you even mentioned was walking in the footsteps of one of the characters, one of the women, and realizing how hard it was for that woman to walk with the disability she had.
Absolutely. That's it. I physically went myself to the towns that I was writing about in the book, which are Ottawa, Illinois, and then also Newark and Orange in New Jersey. And it was the Magia sisters who I looked up the addresses of where these women were living at the time and went to their home addresses and walked the same streets that they would walk to get a real sense of what their daily life was like. Mm-hmm. And as you say, these are women who were crippled by their jobs. This is what this book is about. It's about, the discovery of a new occupational illness and the fight for justice to try to hold the companies responsible for it. So to think of a crippled woman, trying to get to her sister's house, for example, as it was, and I realized there was this really steep hill. And just to imagine Albina trying to walk that walk, with her hips that were locked, the fact that she had this limp, one leg began shortening. These were some of the symptoms that she experienced because of the radium poisoning she endured. And that just really brought it home to me, the struggles that they would have faced just on a daily basis. And in terms of how did I bring them to life? Well, it was an enormous research trip. It wasn't just going and walking the streets and visiting their churches and going to the sites of the dial painting studios, even though I did all of those things. It was also looking in the records to try to find their own voices and their own words. And I was just so thrilled that I found those records, letters, diaries, newspaper interviews, trial transcripts, so that if you read my book, it is to hear from the Radium Girls themselves. They tell you in their own words what happened to them. And I think the final part of the research I just want to mention is that I interviewed family members as well, because as I say, what I wanted to do was to bring these individual women to life, and no one knows us better than our families. And so I reached out to sons and daughters, to sisters, to nieces and nephews, and was able to interview them about their relatives and ask about, what were their hobbies, what did their voices sound like, what were their sick rooms like towards the end of their life, the sights, smells, sounds of these places. And I was overwhelmed by the fact that every single family I reached out to responded positively and generously and shared their photograph albums and their memories and the girls' rosary beads and, everything that they could, share with me, they did. And then I poured that knowledge and that affection and love for the women, love that I myself felt too. All of that is poured into the book to try and, resurrect these heroines really, so that the readers can connect with them too as people.
Heroines indeed. I mean, at times I felt like I was sitting in the room with the oak table with Catherine and Tom. And I don't think you get that experience as the reader unless the author's going and seeing these things and feeling these experiences.
Yeah. I said, I do, you mentioned you felt a connection with the women through reading the book. I have felt that connection almost all the way through my journey with them. As I say, the moment I discovered that script, I have felt a connection with the women, and it's sort of been my mission to try to ensure that they're remembered, which is why it's so wonderful to talk to you today about them, because it's another chance to share their story and bring it to the world and to all the people that listen to your podcast.
And we know Radium now, these were dial painters. And they were instructed to paint the radium on dials on clocks so that they would glow in the dark for men in the trenches, World War I and eventually World War II. And we know radium is a poisonous substance now, large part due to these women. But at the time, it was a wonder element. And you had talked about how this was sort of a liberation time for these women as well. And this was a great job, right?
A fantastic job. It was actually known as the elite job for the poor working girls. And that was for several reasons. It was incredibly lucrative. The girls were paid by the number of dials that they did. And the most skilled workers were basically in the top 5% of female wages nationally. So it was a job that paid the girls more than 3 times the average factory floor worker. So the money was great. It was artistic. It was glamorous because they themselves got to work with this shining glow-in-the-dark substance. And, you know, very human stories came out of my research, such as Catherine Donahue in Illinois, remembering that she and her friends used to wear their good dresses to the plant because they get covered by this glowing dust as they were working in the studios. And then they go out dancing after work, and they'd be these sort of shimmering fireflies, you know, on the dance floors of the speakeasies and the music halls. And as you say, you know, not only did they think that radium was safe because their companies told them it was safe, but radium had this reputation at the turn of the century and into the 1920s and even the early 1930s, that it was this wonder drug, this cure-all. So that if you went into your local drugstore, you could buy radium dressings and pills, treating anything from hay fever to gout or constipation. You could buy radium lingerie to boost your sex life. And because people thought, oh, it's this, medicinal thing that will work wonders, you know, people actually thought, well, perhaps it's not just that it cures me when I get sick. Perhaps I can take it as a kind of vitamin. So people actually drank radium water as a health tonic. And the recommended dose of this radioactive drink was 5 to 7 glasses a day. You know, they put it into chocolate, for example, to, you know, the boost that we all think, oh, the cocoa, the sugar, it's going to, you know, pep me up, with a sprinkling of radium in there as well. The idea was that it would, you know, sort of eliminate that fatigue, that we all experience, and that it would really sort of pep you up. So this is the world that the girls lived in. So they thought they were so lucky to be working with this miraculous substance. But as you say, we now know that actually it wasn't safe at all. But what was really shocking to me when I started digging into it is that, yes, you know, all these products were sold, and yes, it was written about in newspapers and magazines as this, you know, the greatest find of history. This is, you know, potentially going to be the answer to human immortality. You know, there were articles in the Newark Evening News in, you know, the 1920s saying, you know, their readers should eat radium tablets because doing so would add years to our lives. This was the world. But actually, when you dig into it, why did people think that it was safe? You know, why was it put in these pills? Why were people downing, you know, gallons of radioactive water? And the research that was published to say a small amount, and that was crucial, a small amount of radium is safe, was published by the radium companies who were supplying the radium for all these products. Because the shocking thing is, my book actually opens not featuring on a radium girl. It starts with a prologue dated 1901, which is 16 years before the book proper opens, with these First World War dial painters going to work. And in 1901, a scientist received a radiation burn from radium. It destroyed his flesh, basically. And very quickly, from the turn of the century, they knew that radium would destroy human tissue and bone. They used it for medicinal purposes to treat cancer. And it had remarkable results. You know, radium's still used today to treat cancer because it does work, it's effective. But the sort of result of that medicinal success was that people thought, well, how can we channel that? And that's where all these other products came from. But from the turn of the century, they knew a large amount of radium was dangerous. It would burn you, as that scientist experienced. It would destroy a tumor, as all the cancer patients experienced. And so lab workers were issued with protective equipment to protect them from the radium. You know, this was really shocking to me. In the laboratories next door to where the radium girls are dial painting, and they're instructed to put their brushes laden with radioactive paint between their lips to make a fine point so that they're swallowing the radium. You know, the labs next door to where this practice is happening, those workers are protected with lead aprons, with ivory tipped tongs, with enforced vacation, so they're not overly exposed. to radium because they knew it was dangerous, but the received wisdom was it's dangerous in large amounts and small amounts are safe. That's why we put small amount in your chocolate. That's why we put a small amount in your radioactive water. And the girls were only using a small amount of radium. But as I say, when you look into it, the reason we thought a small amount was safe is because of this research funded and published by the radium firms.
Yes. And one of the distinctions too between the people who were working in the labs protected with lead aprons and got vacations was they were largely men.
They were, yes. That's a very astute point. And I think for me, again, one of the really shocking facts about this story is that as the Radium Girls inevitably start to become sick, and one of their problems is that radium is an incredibly insidious poisoning. So it takes years to show itself. You know, the book opens with the Radium Girls from the First World War, but actually it's not until the 1920s really that they start to get sick. But even though these women start to get sick and start to die, and dozens of young women who worked in these studios are dying, the authorities don't investigate. They don't do autopsies. There's not an inquiry launched into why all these young, supposedly healthy, you know, formerly healthy women, why are they sickening, becoming crippled? Why are they dying? No one wants to know. No one's interested in investigating that link between their jobs and their sicknesses until a male employee dies. It's only when the first man dies that finally the medical authorities take note and start investigating. And that, you know, black and white fact was just completely shocking to me and really sort of underlined the way that the companies and indeed society to a larger extent, you know, saw these women as expendable.
And that's right. And some of the things, and I don't want to give away the different twist in the book, but some of the ways that they said that these girls developed these illnesses was because they had syphilis or because, and this was my favorite. I grew up with three sisters, my mom, I was the only boy in the house. This is my favorite. Their nerves. They were their nerves. That was,
yeah.
I mean, it just made me cringe.
That's
you know?
it.
And
it's kind of, it's all in her head, isn't it? You know, it's so easy to dismiss it that way. And that often happens, you know, with women and diseases. You know, you go to the doctor, they don't listen, they don't believe the women when they talk about the pain. And, you think about the reality of what these women were experiencing. The reality is that when they swallowed the radium, having put the paintbrushes in their mouths, the radium settles in their skeletons, you know, in their bones, in their teeth. And then, as I say, after a number of years, that powerful radioactive substance, you know, a half-life of 1,600 years, immensely radioactive, that power starts making itself known inside the women. So that when they studied the women later, they found that their bones were honeycombed and moth-eaten in appearance. They literally had holes in them, you know, holes that were drilled by the radium while the women are still alive. And these women go to their doctors and they try and explain the pain that they're in. You know, Catherine Sharp said the only thing she could compare it to was a dentist drilling on a live nerve, you know, minute after minute, hour after hour, day after day. These women go to their doctors, they explain their suffering, and the doctors send them home with aspirin. And they say, well, it might be arthritis or rheumatism, even though these are women, you know, in their early 20s. Aspirin, when you've got, you know, holes being made in your bones, it's just so shocking. And for me, this is part of the power of their story, is that even though they were suffering so greatly, they embark on this landmark fight for justice and this landmark legal campaign, and they do it all even though they're in the worst possible health imaginable. You know, the strength of these women was truly extraordinary.
It really was. And the book, I think, is about powerful women. And for me, it was about powerful women, what powerful women can do, because these were not just people who were sent home by doctors. They were shunned by their communities because the communities were concerned about losing an employer when they brought the legal action.
Exactly.
And you mentioned about the half-life of radium. And this seems like a battle we deal with all the time, learning about new toxicity and certain materials at plants, and communities worried about losing those jobs. But the ultimate impact was that these communities are still dealing with the effects of the radium to this day.
They are. Yeah, to this day. And I mean that literally. You know, I visited Ottawa just before the pandemic hit again, and they're still doing the cleanup. So that's, you know, 2019, they are still cleaning up from these events that I'm writing about from the First World War and the Roaring Twenties. That community is still affected. And of course, they're doing the cleanup now, but for decades, there was no cleanup, so that community was exposed to the ravages of the radioactive material left behind by these dial painting studios. You know, increased rates of cancer. You know, there were houses that were built on radioactive landfill because, you know, an offshoot of the refining radium process was this kind of substance that was a bit like sand, but highly radioactive. And they sold it to the council, and the council, you know, built houses on it.
Right.
So there was another big lawsuit in the 1980s, I think it was, where the new homeowners sued, you know, to try and get some recompense from the fact that their homes had been built on this radioactive landfill. You know, it's a huge sort of fallout for, you know, that's probably quite an apt word to use, but the fallout from these cases lasted for decades and impacted, you know, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people.
Generations of people.
Yeah,
exposed to this, developing cancer. And at the time, again, and it's important, I think, for lawyers who listen to this and who talk with their clients who are afraid of the blowback from situations like this, that these women were dealing with jaws falling apart. And I don't want to put that lightly. You have to read the book to understand what they went through. But they were dealing with some of the most horrific disabilities you could imagine. They were being eaten from the inside out.
Yeah.
And they were almost pariahs in their communities. They knew what the future held for them, that this was fatal. And they still put all that on their back, and they said, we're still going to fight for this.
Yeah. One of my favorite quotes in the book comes from Grace Fryer, and she's asked about the legal case, and she said, "It's not for myself that I care. I'm thinking more of the hundreds of other girls to whom this may serve as an example." And I think the Radium Girls are an example to us all. You know, as you say, the strength that they showed and the determination to do the right thing, no matter how much pain they were in, no matter that they themselves would not see the benefit. This was too important to let go. And it's, you know, worth saying as well that it took some extraordinary lawyers to help them with this fight for justice and the change that they brought about in the world, because so many lawyers knocked them back, you know, and these women were not just fighting against, you know, their own physical disability, not just fighting against the fact that communities were against them filing suit. They were battling incredibly powerful corporations, you know, corporations who had millions of dollars worth of contracts, government contacts and contracts. So, you know, very well protected in the sort of higher echelons, and also fighting against the legal situation of the time, you know, laws that had been deliberately drafted to try to ensure that no one could claim compensation. You know, the women are sort of fighting to overturn the existing, you know, legal situation to ensure that other people, you know, will benefit from that going forward, and that any future people suffering what they have suffered will also benefit. You know, they're literally fighting to change the world.
And what's amazing is that, like you said, they did. They took this fight on their own, but they did have some very good lawyers to help them out. One of those is
amazing lawyers. Yeah.
One of those is a guy by the name of Leonard Grossman, who you write about in your book, a very theatrical lawyer, dramatic flair.
Yes.
And we're going to have the opportunity to talk with his son at a later time. We can explore that. But one of the things that you did was you pointed out how through this fight, changes were made. It was the precursor, and then eventually OSHA. OSHA was established, which protects workers all around the United States.
Exactly. And, you know, this really was a landmark case as well of trying to hold a company to account. And you touched earlier about, we're still fighting the same fight today. I know that's still the case. And something that really struck me about the story of the Radium Girls is I write about 2 different centers, New Jersey and Illinois. And the legal situation was different in both. So you're fighting, against different state laws, against trying to find a federal law. You're fighting against things like poisons are excluded from occupational poisoning. We kind of, by its very nature, kind of sounds crazy, but that was the situation. You had to get poison added to these things. And as I say, to fight against quite clever legal drafting. So, for example, the first dial painters, try and embark on this case, and they're campaigning to get the law changed, and they finally get radium poisoning added as a compensable disease, but very specifically, it's only radium necrosis, the jaw destruction that you mentioned earlier. And it doesn't include any of the other many symptoms that the Radium Girls suffered, such as aching backs, because the destruction in their bones was not just limited to their jaws. Grace Fryer, who I write about, when they x-rayed her back, they found that her vertebrae had been crushed, but such an injury was not compensable under the law as drafted because it impacted on her spine and not on her jaw. The statute of limitations was another bugbear that they had to fight against because, as I've mentioned, radium poisoning normally takes around 5 years to show itself. It can actually be longer. It can sometimes be decades before a woman will start suffering. It's almost like a kind of time bomb poisoning where a woman will seem healthy and then suddenly a tumor might start to grow, or she'll suffer some other ailment relating to this job that she might have done in her teens or her 20s, and it's now decades later. But because of this longevity of the poisoning, many women didn't start, to know that they were even sick, but the statute of limitations was 2 years. So that, there was no way that they could claim compensation because the law had been drafted to exclude this type of poisoning. So for me, part of the fight for justice as well is sort of looking out for those, the way the laws have been drafted and to try and take on, that element as well, so that you can actually see justice done, because too often there were sort of lobbyists from manufacturing associations or so on, trying to protect the companies. So perhaps they'll be seen to do the right thing because they agree to a law going through. But when you drill down into the specifics of the law, actually, it's drafted so that the women, it's designed so that no one will ever claim compensation.
What's incredible is in Missouri, we have a group of women who head up our lobbying efforts at the Capitol on behalf of trial lawyers and on behalf of the people we represent. And what I tell people is, look, trial lawyers are going to figure out a way to fight for their clients. What you're doing is you're hurting the people in your constituencies. And one of them was that she's an executive director, Sarah Shute, and her grandmother was a dial painter. And she talks about how when her grandma went on dates with her grandpa, that she would glow. I think you talk about it in the book as, oh, that luminosity, oh, that glow. And she said she's reminded of her grandma every time she fights for occupational hazards. And this book is such a testament to how if you just fight, things will eventually happen, but you got to keep fighting.
Yeah, it's definitely a story of perseverance. It does take years for the legal cases to be resolved and for justice to be done. And as you say, it takes some extraordinary lawyers. And one thing I loved about my research into the lawyers, and one of them, Raymond Berry, who was the New Jersey lawyer, his files were donated to the Library of Congress. So I was able really to drill down into a lot of what he had done for the women. And what I found really interesting was looking at his diary. And he often had the women in, he would often drive them places. One of them had, was caught up in domestic violence. Her husband was abusive. And it was Raymond Berry who went and, sort of did little things like sorted out clothes, I think. And I think my memory is he went and picked up clothes for the abusive husband so that, so that the wife didn't have to deal with him. He would do small things like that so that to try and make their lives easier. And would drive them places and really help them with every element of their lives. And I think that personal relationship was really integral, you know. And similarly with Leonard Grossman, the Illinois lawyer, you know, I found, you know, holiday season cards that he was exchanging with the women. Len, his son, told me a great story about him, you know, getting in a 2-seater plane in the middle of a blizzard to make sure that he got down to Ottawa so that he could see his clients. You know, this really was sort of above and beyond. And, you know, lawyers who really cared about the outcome for their clients. And, you know, Len Grossman actually, you know, essentially worked pro bono, you know, and his son remembered about him, you know, he'd take shoes for payment if his clients couldn't pay, because doing the right thing and fighting for the underdog was more important than financial recompense. You know, it was using his skills to enrich the world and to fight against, you know, this injustice, basically. And that's the kind of legal champions that the Radium Girls needed, because they really were the underdogs in this situation, and it took these very special lawyers helping them in order for the women to really change the world.
And for any trial lawyer out there, I would like, most trial lawyers know this, but we're storytellers, and you can learn so much from Kate's book on how to tell a story, on how to tell these girls' stories. And I'm looking forward to your new book, Kate. Could you please tell us about that?
Sure. And it's out this year, June 22nd, 2021. It's called The Woman They Could Not Silence. And it tells the extraordinary story of a woman called Elizabeth Packard, who many people, again, have never heard of, just like the Radium Girls. It starts with a simple question. What would happen if your husband could commit you to an insane asylum just because you disagreed with him? And we talked earlier about how the Radium Girls' illnesses were dismissed as nerves, and how women, you know, can be dismissed by the claim you're crazy. And those are the kind of issues that I'm exploring in the book. And specifically for listeners to your podcast, this is another book that has a courtroom drama at its center, and that is looking, you know, in a really interesting way at, you know, how do we define sanity? And there's actually a landmark legal case where Elizabeth's sanity is tested by jurors. You know, is she insane, as her husband says, because she's so assertive and stands up to him and has her own opinions? You know, is that madness in a woman? Or, as she claims, is she sane? And it's her husband who, you know, has embarked on this crazy act of trying to lock her up in an insane asylum. So it's another story of a fight against injustice. Yep. It's another story with courtroom drama at its heart. And it's a really empowering and inspirational story, giving you a glimpse into what it was like to be locked up in an insane asylum in the 19th century, and how those issues still resonate today. You know, I was really struck that last summer, Vice President, as she is now, Kamala Harris, was called a mad woman by Donald Trump. And the book sort of is looking at how, you know, women sticking their heads above the parapet, you know, stepping outside of their spheres are called crazy, and how those, I'm doing it through the sort of prism of one woman's dramatic story, but I think they're issues that still resonate today. Absolutely.
They're just, sometimes they're more hidden, but the same stereotypes and biases and prejudices are certainly there. And I cannot wait to read this. As you're describing it, I'm imagining myself in a courtroom fighting for Elizabeth. And exactly. So, you know, and it's so powerful. And I could feel Lynn Grossman and Barry fighting for these women. And I'm so grateful that we're able to go through this book with you, and that you wrote these stories. And I just want to conclude the way you concluded, if you don't mind. Sure. At the end of your book, you say, in this way, the Radium Girls live on, shining through the darkness of history to blaze a light for good, for strength, and for courage. It has been an enormous honor to play a small part in helping them to do that. In the end, this book belongs to them. I simply hope that I've done them justice. And you truly did, Kate. And we're all the better for it. And I thank you so much for coming on.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for shining a light on their story.
Go and get this book. If you want it, send me a message. I'll buy it and I'll send it to you. It's gonna make you a better person and a better trial lawyer. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's so interesting to hear, going back that far, World War I, that you had companies that were putting out a product and doing their own research on the product and talking about how it's safe. And then you think about asbestos and you think about talc, and, here we are 100 years later, essentially, and
Yep.
big corporations are doing the same thing for the sake of money.
Yep. And I'm reading a book, Dynasty of Pain. It's about the Sackler family who owns Purdue Pharma. And companies continue to do this. And the reason why we know about the Radium Girls and their story and their fight is because they actually decided to put their foot down and say, something's not wrong. Something's not right with our coworkers. What we're being told is wrong. And they did this in the face of insurmountable odds. And so we have to keep going. We have to kind of carry that, baton on and keep that fight going, because if not, this is just going to continue to happen every generation.
Mm-hmm. We're working a case now here in Louisville where dietary supplement company, young woman in her early 20s took a dietary supplement and essentially ruined her liver because of it. And, there are no disclosures, no nothing. And, sure enough, the FDA had come down on this company. So we're, looking forward to moving forward on that case.
Yep. And then you got companies, like you said, the asbestos, the talc, the opioids. They have their own research that's done by their own physicians, I'll put in quotes, to support their opinions. And then, you find out 20 years after tragedy happens, this is all cooked up.
Mm-hmm. I was at the Attorney General's office at a time when that was kind of starting to come to a close. All the AGs all across the country were suing these companies and, showing how the studies were funded, by the companies for the doctors to do. They're sending the doctors on all these junkets to talk about how great their product is. And, they're measuring how many prescriptions a particular doctor is writing. And, a lot changed kind of, in 2010s, early 2000, teens, late, 2008, 9. So, things started to change, but, the effects of what these companies have done, still persist today.
Yeah. And if you go back 100 years when things were a little bit looser and doctors were trusted more, and you've got lay people like these girls working in these factories who are being told by the people they work for and the doctors, you're fine. This has nothing to do with your work. You're going to be fine. This is because this girl has syphilis that she's sick. This is because this girl has this other condition. My favorite is when they say, this is because she's just overly emotional. Mm-hmm. And the fact that they were able to say, this still doesn't pass the smell test. I think that is a standard that they set for us to continue, like I said, carrying it on. And there's nothing new under the sun. So you got to keep digging.
Yeah. You
got to keep fighting. If something doesn't seem right, we have the power to investigate, look into it, and try to change it.
Well, Mike, until next time, keep fighting the fight.
Looking forward to it, brother.
That wraps another episode of the official Lawyer Minds podcast. Please consider subscribing to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. Explore the other content Lawyer Minds has to offer and engage with us on social media. Your feedback on the show and ideas for future shows is always welcomed. See you next time.